Well, welcome everyone to the University of London and to the Senate House Library Charles Holden Memorial Lecture for 2025. My name is Andrew Nash, and as chair of the Friends of the Library, I'm delighted to be able to introduce this evening's event. The Holden Lecture is held annually and traditionally takes its inspiration from one of the library's collection strengths. This year, the focus is on pamphlets and ephemeral print, an area where the library is unusually rich, with collections that cut across historical periods, geographical locations, and printed formats. And some of those riches are on display in the library's current exhibition, Spineless Wonders, The Power of Print Unbound. And if you've not already done so, I do urge you to visit the exhibition, which you can find on the 4th floor of this building, the entrance floor to the library. It will be running until the 29th of November. Before introducing this evening's speaker, I'd like to take a few minutes to update you on other recent developments and activities in the library and involving the Friends. The library is now well into the swing of its ambitious multi-year project to transform its collections and its spaces into a next-generation, high-quality research library accessible to all. By reimagining our spaces and investing in and harnessing the power of technology, the library has strengthened its position as a world-leading centre for research, teaching, and community outreach. A new integrated library and discovery platform has recently been launched, and further developments will include enhanced digital collections and a new special collections centre. The Friends of Senate House Library is playing an important role in this transformation. Thanks to the generosity of our donors, many of whom are in this room, we were recently able to relaunch the Visiting Research Fellowship Scheme. And I'm delighted to say that we have recently made 3 awards to support visiting scholars who will each be working here during the course of this academic year for a 2-week period. Working on 3 different collections: the Cartonera Publishers Collection, the papers of Thomas Lewin family, residents of British India, and the archives of the 20th century publisher Gerald Duckworth. So an indication there of the breadth of collections that we have. But now it's time to turn to this evening's lecture and this evening's speaker. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Jason Peacey, Professor of Early Modern British History at University College London. Jason's research focuses on the political culture of early modern Britain, and he is particularly interested and renowned for his work in the relationship between print culture and the practices of political life. This extends to an examination of censorship, propaganda, and diplomacy in the context of the spread of newspapers and pamphlet publications, the influence and experiences of the early modern information revolution, and the political traffic between Britain and Europe. His many books include Politicians and Pamphleteers, Propaganda in the Civil Wars and Interregnum, Print and Public Politics in the English Revolution, and most recently, the fascinatingly titled book, The Madman and the Church Robber, Law and Conflict in Early Modern England. Jason has worked as a consultant on a number of television documentaries, including episodes of Who Do You Think You Are? And a 2005 Channel 4 series on the English Civil War. He has also contributed to several BBC radio programmes. His lecture this evening is entitled Tickets and Trifles, Ephemeral Print and Restoration England. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jason Peacey, who delivers the 2025 Holden Lecture.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It's a great honour to be here, and thank you all for turning up. And I hope that my slides are visible and not too grainy. Some of the images might be a bit grainy. We will see. In April 1680, a printed flyer, seen here, called A Penny Well Bestowed appeared around London to announce a new venture by William Dockwra and others that had already been trailed by a newspaper advert. It boasted about, quote, a new and useful invention for the great increase of trade and ease of correspondence. This scheme, which became known as the Penny Post, promised an amazingly cheap, regular and speedy means of conveying letters across London and its suburbs, involving a headquarters, 7 sorting office, and apparently hundreds of receiving houses, each visited by messengers every hour between 7 a.m. and 10 p.m, with items being delivered within 3 hours. How lucky they were. This document epitomises the material with which I'm concerned this evening. Those spineless wonders that, as we've already heard, feature in the wonderful current Senate House exhibition. This relates to ephemeral, printed material that might be regarded as trivial, cheap to produce, and eminently disposable. It was generally, although not invariably, freely distributed or publicly displayed. It was fragile and easily lost, and it is often overlooked, nowadays as then, or taken for granted. And today I focus, unlike the exhibition, which is very diverse, today I focus on a period when it first became ubiquitous, and when its novelty generated comment and indeed collector. This ephemera, sometimes referred to by historians as little jobs that perhaps sustained the printing industry, as opposed to big Bibles and the complete works of Shakespeare and so on. This ephemera has begun to attract historians' attention. And historians are now, I guess, at least a little bit familiar with some of its many varieties, some more than others, from petitions and lobbying documents to ballads and handbills like this one, and from advertisements to pro formas, or what they would have called tickets, and then on to early newspapers. And these historians have begun to try and connect such material to things like political participation, bureaucratization, and state formation. This work, however, it seems to me, is still very much in its infancy, and there are definitely challenges involved in analysing material so voluminous. My talk, in that sense, asks 2 fairly straightforward questions. Why should we study such material, and how best can we do so? And my suggestion is that ephemera helps us to see a period in new ways. And Dockwra's flyer has not been chosen at random. Rather than focus, as some historians have perhaps done, on a single type of ephemera, the petition, the form, I want to survey a diverse body of printed material relating to a specific topic, and that topic is postal services, to facilitate what I want to call an infrastructural approach to the period. So infrastructures involve what you might call the ambient environment of everyday life, the built networks that facilitate flows of goods, people and ideas, fostering exchange and interaction across space. These infrastructures have attracted attention from historians, more obviously perhaps for periods later than mine, normally for the 18th and 19th century and so on, in relation to things like roads, development of railways, and indeed, in the 19th century, sanitation. Crucially, as anthropologists have argued, anthropologists better at this than historians, it seems to me, infrastructures not only have technical or technological dimensions, physical entity, but they also betray what you might call a rationality. They embody ideas, and they both reflect and influence societies. And inspired by that kind of scholarship, I want to address the history and significance of the post office in the decades after it became a public, as opposed to merely a royal, service in 1637, and to try and integrate it into a broader history of the late 17th century. So my aim is to use this print ephemera to explore how the post office became embedded into daily life and public consciousness, and how it was thought about in a period of dramatic upheaval and rapid change. My suggestion will be that this ephemeral print, both surviving and lost, reveals an infrastructural mindset that I think sheds important light upon political culture and political consciousness. My first point, first of four, is that print ephemera connects the post office to a world of projecting. So spurred by Daniel Defoe's fairly famous depiction of his age as what he called a projecting age, historians are familiar with the pervasive language of improvement and with myriad practical schemes for effecting beneficial social and economic change. They are aware of important innovators, Gregory King, John Graunt, William Petty, Charles Davenant, whose ideas and plans relied upon print in a series of ways to collect data, to lobby politicians, and to garner public interest. Crucial here is the rise of what we refer to as political arithmetic or political economy, sometimes called the art of reasoning by figures or numbers. In other words, the determination to measure and quantify resources and then to deploy such knowledge in the service of planning and decision-making. Examined in this context, what Dockwra and other postal reformers was classic projectors, or to use his term, and some of the others that I'm talking about use this term too, undertakers. They were undertakers, not in the modern sense of the term. Undertakers, people who developed new inventions and then sought to oversee their implementation. So they're not just thinkers, they are doers. So first, Dockwra and other innovators produced an array of, and indeed a vast quantity of promotional print. And from the 1650s onwards, repeated examples can be found of petitions, lobby documents, and so on, targeting decision makers in Westminster and Whitehall, and then handbills, advertisements, and so on, aimed at a broader audience of what Dockwra referred to as ingenuous people. These texts commented explicitly upon the deployment of these things in public, referring to them as printed tickets. We have in all our printed tickets and advertisements. There's a self-consciousness about how they're using it. And they also noted how such material was scattered up and down. And onlookers, like the two here, might be hard to make out these are annotations by people who picked up some of this stuff and indeed collected it. And onlookers frequently commented upon items cast about upon the exchange or pasted upon the posts. Secondly, this ephemera indicates that the post office became an exercise in measurement, quantification, and technical expertise. We can track the development and increased density of postal networks and observe a determination to map territory and measure distances with greater precision. Absolutely integral to how the post office was developed. Could only be developed doing that kind of thing. We can observe how accurate information was tabulated and mapped for official purposes, but then printed for public consumption, like this elaborate map. What we can't really make out is they are attempting to overlay onto a map of England the postal routes and demonstrating distances and so on. So a lot of print is demonstrating the existence and the development of this network, and then these things get advertised in newspapers like the London Gazette. Dockwra himself was explicit that his project was inspired by the need to grapple with and to measure the dimensions of a rapidly expanding capital city. And his scheme bore remarkable similarities, kind of conceptually, to William Petty's rather little-known idea, sketched out here on a scrap of paper, and then he describes it at greater length. But the idea is for a zonal postal system for the capital, predicated upon, you see some of his calculations, predicated upon accurate mapping. We need to divide the city up accurately and then create an effective infrastructure. Thirdly, postal reformers deployed classic projecting language. Here's the language of undertakers. Referring to how their schemes would bring great improvement and promote the public good. We are undertakers for public good. One of Dockwra's leaflets, there's boundless optimism here. One of Dockwra's leaflets boasted that the usefulness of the penny post was unlimited and infinitely extensive. More importantly, print ephemera connects the post office with the neglected dimensions of early modern projecting, and indeed neglected characters. Robert Murray, Hugh Chamberlain, and Henry Robinson, that I want to single out, who demonstrate that improvement of this kind involved not just isolated, a range of isolated schemes, but very self-consciously interrelated schemes, anchored in notions of infrastructure and circulation. These men, Murray, Chamberlain, Robinson, were all accomplished in deploying print, producing dozens of ephemeral texts that have not actually received that much attention, to make precisely timed interventions in parliamentary proceedings and to attract customers and public subscriptions. Their vision of improvement embraced schemes relating to credit, debt, banking, taxation, but also the advancement of trade and manufacturing, not least to reduce unemployment and alleviate poverty. Poverty is a big issue. They sought to make England rich and happy, in their terms, in the round, i.e. this was not a matter of isolated schemes. We had to think about this. They had to think about this in the round. Excuse me. And their proposals for public works, they explicitly use that term, involved enhancing flows of money, developing networks of institutions, and improving transport infrastructure, even down to quite seemingly obvious things like signposts. Turns out signposts didn't exist before the late 17th century. Who knew? The merchant Robinson, from a slightly earlier generation, is particularly striking. So emerging to prominence in the 1640s, he was one of those who pioneered this use of print as a lobbyist and a projector. And he explicitly reflected on the value of this kind of material to get things done. His interests are remarkably diverse, involving trade and customs, banking, coinage, exchange rates, but also law reform, town planning, free state schools for boys and girls, free universal health care. He has to kind of overcome doubters. He says, you think this is a crazy idea. Bear with me. His concern with circulation is evident from ideas about transport systems and from his project for what he called an office of address, or rather a network of offices of intelligence. These were to be, and indeed became, even if only briefly, accessible repositories of useful information, supported and publicized by flyers, and then with a weekly newspaper, and intended to promote connections between people, from physicians to wet nurses, from shorthand tutors to stagecoach operators. These offices functioned as agencies for shipping, for property, for employment, for credit, for lost property, and indeed even marriages. They served, he said, all persons that are any way concerned in buying and selling, or in any kind of employment and dealing. And the aim was to achieve, quote, the better accommodation and ease of people and the universal benefit of the Commonwealth in point of public intercourse. This most excellent public work was predicated on the notion that, quote, the life of all intercourse is quickness of return. Everything needed to circulate, in other words, and speeding. More striking still, this is, I think, where Robinson is kind of mind-blowing, is that Robinson's practical and mechanical ideas for improving the world were linked to his somewhat better known, in isolation, become detached from, his better known views on religious toleration and press freedom, where he's a kind of radical outlier. His entire worldview, it seems to me, was grounded in ideas about the productive value of circulation, flows of goods, free exchange of religious ideas, and the facilitation of political discussion through free petitioning and comment. So these characters are interesting in various ways, but a particular reason for dwelling on them, Murray, Chamberlain, Robinson, is that each of them explicitly had, and indeed had an active interest in, not just as an idea, postal services. Murray and Chamberlain were Dockwra's initial partners. Fell apart quite quickly. Murray also attempted his own postal service, which he promoted with flyers, these are actually tiny, as the inventor and first proposer of the penny post. All three of these undertakers, so that's Murray, Dockwra, and Chamberlain, retained a projecting interest in the postal infrastructure into the 1690s, and in Dockwra's case, into the early 1700s. Robinson, meanwhile, discussed explicitly the need for an effective postal system in his study of trade, as part of that, his ideas about trade. And he recognized that England's infrastructure, where we heard this before, was less robust than that of its European neighbors. And then he acquired a stake in the post office in 1641 and began to, or tried to, implement schemes to extend the network and to improve and cheapen its services. So this breadth and depth of vision was then clearly echoed in Dockwra's project for the penny post. In later life, he patented a new model of coach, travelling coach, what he called an easy coach. And he made fascinating comments about connectivity and circulation. One advert explained that there is nothing more tends to the increase of trade and business than a speedy, cheap, and safe way of intelligence. For, as money like the blood in natural bodies gives life to trade by its circulation, so correspondence like the vital spirits gives it sense and motion. And the more that these abound in any place, the more doth that place increase in riches, strength, and vigour. More prosaically, a functioning postal service for Dockwra was pitched as something that would save all kinds of people time and money, fostering connections between lawyers and clients, patients and physicians, poor prisoners and their creditors, brewers and the excise office. Chapmen, he said, could announce their arrival in town. Meetings could be organised, appointments could be made, and indeed printed bills or tickets could be dispersed to promote any concern. Dockwra advocated, in a striking way it seems to me, unrestrained technological innovation to overcome problems of distance and time. Free exchange would enhance trade and promote limitless improvement. In short, the ephemeral print surrounding the post office reveals a kind of infrastructural thinking that was entirely in step with Defoe's projecting age. My second point is that print ephemera brings into focus how politically controversial the post office was, in ways that, again, mirror other improvement schemes and infrastructures. They all turn out to be highly contentious. Projectors aroused fears that the public good would succumb to private interests, fueled, in their case, by bitter experience and controversies about monopolies. Such concerns ensured that what constituted and promoted the public good that they all talk about was contested. Chamberlain's career certainly reveals, in relation to his kind of banking schemes, that ephemeral print was often needed as much to defend as promote new schemes. And far from being dry and technical, the texts that they produced about improvement were often vituperative and libelous, and indeed scattered up and down, as they said, in coffee houses. One specialised use of advertisements involved notifying people about the times and places when projectors like Chamberlain would be on hand, they would make themselves available, to explain their projects and to respond to their critics or indeed to sceptics. This certainly reflected rival economic interests, but also, it seems to me, the tendency for individual projects to become associated with specific political positions. So it is kind of noteworthy that Chamberlain and Murray were both, in the early 1680s, known associates of the greatest of all Whig grandees, the Earl of Shaftesbury, who seems to have backed the idea for a penny post, perhaps because he saw it as a useful political tool. Murray was arrested for distributing seditious literature in May 1680, exactly the time that the penny post is being set up. Chamberlain needed to obtain an official pardon from the king for his political activities at precisely this time. The penny post was promoted by Whig journalists and thus attacked by Tory journalists. Robinson, too, as you might have gathered from my comments about his views on toleration and so on, and freedom of the press, was a noted political and religious radical, a mercantile Republican, explicitly a Republican, who worked closely with and for the Republican government of the 1650s. And print ephemera, of the kind that I'm focusing on, indicates that any postal system was politically loaded in terms of how and by whom it should be run, its purposes, and the interests it served. It demonstrates how controversial it proved to be to turn this kind of nascent postal system into a centralized and state-controlled monopoly. This is clear from printed petitions submitted to MPs in 1640, the moment of the long Parliament opens, just before the Civil War. Petitions in which the then patentee, a man called Thomas Witherings, was decried by aggrieved postmasters as a monopolist and accused of oppression and of unlawful projects and charged with financial corruption and political corruption. One of the men who was forced out by Witherings, a man called Robert Searle from Hollington in Devon, sought credit for improving the postal system. Now, I'd had the ideas, he said, but he also demanded free liberty from bondage, claiming that it was, quote, lawful for every man to employ himself in a lawful calling, and demanding justice for free subjects. This is 1640. Searle thus anticipated, it seems to me, a radical language of the civil wars and highlighted the ideological dimensions of the postal system. And this quickly became very public and kind of polemical. Witherings responded to such clamours, as he called them, with a pamphlet, a somewhat more public pamphlet, not just for MPs, a full and clear answer to a false and scandalous paper, thereby merely provoking his opponents to respond with a true reply to a false paper. And further claims about the propriety and liberty of every subject. Crucially, it was these claims about liberty which were endorsed in the votes published here, the parliamentary vote to get rid of Witherings in 1642, labelling him as a delinquent, i.e. a political ne'er-do-well. What followed in the years of the 1640s and beyond were printed pamphlets and lobbying about the oppressive conduct of Withering's successor, Edmund Prideaux, who happened to be Attorney General, but also broader claims about liberty. Eventually, in 1649, the Republican government claimed the power to control the post office. It insisted upon some kind of state monopoly and opted to farm our term will be outsourced, if you like, to outsource the running of the post office to a rent-paying subcontractor. So state monopoly and farming as a mechanism. The subsequent tendering process, resulting in the appointment of John Manley as the first person to be called a Postmaster General, became hugely controversial. And amid frenzied petitioning and lobbying by a range of applicants for the job, if you like, a range of printed texts highlighted ideological division over whether state control was acceptable and whether farming as a mechanism was suitable. Some were produced, the one on the left, some were produced by those like David Watkins and the heirs of Witherings, who were untroubled by the idea that the fate of the post office should be in the hands of the state, but who nevertheless insisted on the need to honour previous grants, i.e. the grants that had been made to them, claiming a kind of legal title to the post office as freehold property. Robinson likewise boasted about his rightful title, but he also politicised matters much more clearly. His printed case, seen here on the right, was more explicit in endorsing political control of the mail, to enhance government revenue and to ensure security, state security. Quote, "The trust and power of laying post stages must not be prostituted to the generality, for fear of conveying intelligences to and fro without control to the destruction of the Commonwealth." At the same time, he was nervous about farming it out to people like Witherings. He accused Witherings of corruption. He protested that he himself had been displaced by the prevalency of men of power. And he justified his attempts to kind of force his way in, his interloping activities, by explicitly invoking the liberty of the subject. Other texts, however, were much more radical than this. Especially lobbying documents submitted by those who call themselves the new undertakers. This group initially participated in the tendering process, 1649 to 1653, but did so by seeking to, quote, "prevent the scandal of a monopoly." They knew that that monopoly bit would scare people. And so they tried to ensure that the profits from their scheme would be devoted to public works, the alleviation of poverty, and so on. Having lost out in this tendering process, despite they claimed to have submitted the highest bid, they then made explosive allegations about a corrupt process and about Edmund Prideaux's oppressive and violent behaviour, literally murderous behaviour, according to them. Citing those votes passed in 1642, they declared that monopolies were against the law and the liberty and freedom of the subject. They invoked principles of common liberty and freedom and insisted on the incompatibility between a postal service that was, quote, "beneficial to the people" and a farmed monopoly, which could, as they said, rack and exact upon the people. Conveying letters, they said, was a lawful trade which every man might practice. The result of those kind of those claims was a paper war. Printed, sorry, quotes. Oh, sorry, I've got back. Paper war. Printed flyers by their opponents were pasted upon the posts, posted up and down the city, and cast about upon the exchange, and then inserted into government newspapers. The interlopers replied with the case of the undertakers, insisting upon, as they said here, the birthright of every freeman from monopolising restraints and mercenary farming, and upon, quote, "a right of liberty in the free people of England by way of common postage to send and carry as they please." So this language of liberty and rights is being attached to and explained through something very practical like the post office. To restrain free communication was to destroy society. Free postage was a boon to the weal of the merchant and industrious trader. An official monopoly would privilege the idle drone and contravene distributive justice. Here too we see the language of circulation. Any restraint of lawful industries is a kind of strangling and stopping the lifeblood to flow freely in all its veins. Blocking veins hurts the whole natural body. In public life, it damaged the body politic. The Undertakers, now we're back on track. The Undertakers were defeated, but the controversies that they kind of brought to the surface rumbled on over the propriety of a postal monopoly and over whether farming public works served to prostitute, their kind of term, the public interest to something private. Their arguments were echoed in complaints, almost every single subsequent Postmaster General. Complaints about Manley and his successor, John Thurlow. They resurfaced in print in 1659, as you see here on the left, another moment of political turmoil and intellectual ferment. So lobbying Parliament with the very first proposal for a penny post, a man called John Hill, insisted that carrying letters was the liberty and birthright of every Englishman. He spoke for the interests of active tradesmen, and he opposed both state control and farming. Such contestation continued after 1660, as we see here on the right, in the face of repeated attempts to justify this kind of farmed state monopoly via legislation and proclamation. So Postmaster General like Henry Bishop, who became Postmaster General in 1660, publicly denounced as untrustworthy custodians, self-interested oppressors of humble postmasters, unreliable guardians of private affairs and state security. Controversy over the letter monopoly became connected to other infrastructural issues, as commercial stagecoach services proliferated and offered alternative options for carrying mail. That's a threat to the monopoly. There too, parliamentary debates were accompanied by vigorous campaigning, printed lobbying, promotional flyers, rehearsing rival ideas about political economy, postal monopolies, and government revenue. The government prosecuted numerous of these coachmen for kind of breaking in on the letter-carrying trade and then publicised their punishment via the Gazette to deter others. And this brings us back to Dockwra's penny post. So, as I hinted earlier, disputes among the original projectors or undertakers occurred quite quickly and led to some public bickering involving printed flyers dispersed about the city, adverts in newspapers. But more importantly, Dockwra was also forced to deploy adverts and handbills in response to what he called opposition from ignorant and envious people. This involved London's porters, who feared being driven out of business. In response to them, he says, that's kind of Luddism. We would never have had any improvement if we'd have adopted that attitude. Some of these porters are prosecuted for indeed tearing down copies of Dockwra's adverts, the breach of the public peace. More serious were the claims that the penny post contravened the state monopoly and reduced government revenue. Allegations which Dockwra rebutted, or tried to rebut, by insisting that his was a new invention, key term for him, different from and an improvement upon the General Post Office. His, he said, worked for the benefit of the subject and the public good. The penny post, he said, would generate, not hurt, government revenue. And interestingly, he likened high postage rates to an illegal tax upon the inhabitants without their consent. But he nevertheless faced what he called unreasonable and very expensive lawsuits, dozens of them, prompting a succession of appeals via handbills to what he called an honest understanding English jury and learned, upright, and honourable judges. Please come to my aid, see your sense. This is plea. His service, however, was shut down, or rather appropriated by the General Post Office, which quickly adopted precisely his marketing techniques and became a phenomenal success. As he predicted, it would generate lots of revenue. Dockwra's response following the Glorious Revolution, and it's interesting that it's after the Glorious Revolution, 1688-9, merely confirmed the influence of print and ideological contestation. He lobbied MPs and committees with printed statements, like the ones on the left, the top left, and returned to newspaper advertising, asserting his role as the inventor of the penny post. This partly involved trying to counter what he called a malicious false report that Murray was the true inventor, and this, he said, was industriously spread around the coffee houses of London. More importantly, he protested about being unjustly deprived of his scheme, decrying the rulings against him as unduly gotten, and referring to the arbitrary and indirect proceedings of the then Duke of York, the recently, by this stage, deposed James II. You connect the Duke of York with arbitrary proceeding. James, the Duke of York, he had said, had been seduced by evil agents. This is powerful political language for the time. Classic parliamentarian and republican language is being used in relation to public debate around the post office. You can say that in 1689, because James is no longer there. But he generates more controversy by doing this. His printed answer to Dockwra's case insisted that he had acted in defiance of the law and in opposition to the government, signalling, I think, the idea that he's a sort of political troublemaker. This was denounced by Dockwra for asserting several untruths, this text, and for being thrown into coffee houses and other places. It's a very vigorous campaign against it, prompting his own attempt to, quote, advertise the public by ensuring that his reply was dispersed in every coffee house, complete with a note, you can see at the bottom, a note asking readers not to take away this paper. Very obviously a dispersed thing around town. Dockwra eventually received a state pension for his troubles and huge losses. But more important for my purposes is how such print brought debate over the proper configuration of the post office into the public domain. And more importantly, made kind of fundamental ideological issues, rights, liberties, political power, relevant to the infrastructure of daily life. My third point is that ephemeral print, both surviving and lost, historians really shouldn't talk too much confidently about things that aren't there, was crucial to how the post office functioned as infrastructure, the internal workings of it, if you like, but also how it became embedded into daily life and impinged upon public consciousness. So in part, this is a matter of public information, as we would call it. So as already noted, printed text by projectors served multiple purposes and different audiences. But these purposes included very kind of functional describing of the services that were being offered as part of a print landscape in the second half of the 17th century that was increasingly geared towards providing useful knowledge. So as with so many improvement schemes, many texts around the post office focused on mechanical dimensions of the postal service, how it worked, and emphasizing the effectiveness, the reliability of this infrastructure. So, for example, faced with competition from the so-called new undertakers in 1653, the operators of the old post office, as they called themselves, produced a notice for all gentlemen, merchants and persons, setting out postage rates, days of posting, and the addresses of their receiving officers. Subsequent legislation, which established state monopolies and justified state monopolies, also provided details about how the service worked. We can see an advert explicitly called an advertisement by Henry Bishop, describing each of the main postal routes, listing the key stages, explaining how this was being extended to places never before settled, he said, and how frequency was being increased. These documents, in other words, give us, as they gave contemporaries, a vivid picture of the network's density in terms of the obscure places that were now staging posts, from Marazion in Cornwall to Aberdyfi in Gwynedd. Bishop also produced a much more focused sheet, explaining how problems with the service to Cumberland, which had not been so speedy as it ought, had now been settled, and describing the route along which mail would be constantly dispersed, as he said, every Tuesday and Saturday. In 1663, Bishop's successor, Daniel O'Neill, produced a printed sheet for persons of all qualities and degrees, which announced a new service between London and Sheffield, with details about the stages, the distances involved, the days and hours when mail would pass through each town. Dockwra, in that sense, by 1680, is picking up on that kind of trend. He too produced a sheet for information to all people where to deliver their letters. You don't need a sexy title, you need a practical title, which listed penny post offices across London and described the workings of a system not, he said, yet thoroughly understood. His successors did much the same, using flyers and posters to name the various offices across London, to list the destinations served. You can, it turns out, by 1685, send a letter to where I live in Carlshilton using the penny system. That's quite a long way. Such publicity offered reassurance that letters were in safe hands. Bishop insisted upon the care taken to employ faithful and diligent persons, noting that postmasters entered bonds not to commit or suffer neglects, frauds, or exactions, and that he would take it as a friendship from any person to inform him if any of his said officers do act to the contrary. Dockwra repeatedly used printed text to outline the practical method of the penny post and to demonstrate how standards would be maintained, most obviously, and perhaps famously, by explaining how date stamps, an innovation, at least in England, by him, how date stamps, together with what are called exact registers, would make it possible to track the progress and speed of mail and to demonstrate that individual items have been received and indeed delivered. Pleading for patience. I'm pleading for patience with the clippers on it. Pleading for patience while he resolved teething problems, unreliable receivers who had appropriated people's money, he devised a pro forma notice, part of the function of which was to identify individuals who'd been sacked, you need a gap in the text to insert name, and to name their replacements. Ultimately, this embedding of the post office and its processes in the public consciousness, very clearly being done as something that's new and needs explaining, is evident from and was facilitated by printed compendia of useful information during the later 17th century. Richard Bloom's Britannia named 142 postal stages, 384 postal towns, enthused about the post office as an exceeding great convenience, and exclaimed that there is scarce a market town of note, but hath the benefit of the conveyance of letters to and fro. John Playford's Vard Macon tabulated each of the main post roads, complete with distances, and provided information about postal rates and post day. Thomas DeLorme's Present State of London supplemented its description of the postal system with gushing comments about a volume of mail so prodigiously great by this stage, before extolling and defending the public utility of Dockwra's, as he described it, ingenious innovation. Most importantly, that's the big picture on the right, Essential information about the functioning of the postal system appeared annually in Edward Chamberlain's Anglia Notitia, which effused about the useful and ingenious post office, penny post, with its extraordinary infrastructure of messengers, receiving houses, and sorting offices. They see that this is new, they are struck by how impressive it is, and they want to tell about that. More striking, but much harder to observe, so this is all very public, right? Much harder to observe is the deployment of print within the post office. Most of this material, this is perilous territory because most of it is lost. But tantalizing items survive, as do the invaluable letterbooks of a man called Roger Whitley, Deputy Postmaster General in the 1670s. If only we had these across the whole country, thinking a goldmine. References to printed papers in Whitley's letters. He's writing hundreds of letters a week to postmasters across the country. References to printed papers are everywhere. Such evidence points to a world saturated by print. And while this might simply be thought to signal the value or the necessity of print as an administrative tool, without which a large and complex institution could not function, it also highlights the ethos of the postal infrastructure and its place in contemporary consciousness. So first, printed tickets, as they call them, and forms of a kind that were integral to so many projecting schemes, inscribed administrative processes and relationships. These included the printed articles, routinely sent to and signed by individual postmasters. These were, every single one of them. These were doubtless printed for reasons of cost and efficiency, but they also constituted something of a novelty, a formal employment contract. These documents were utterly commonplace in the 1670s and 1680s. They are now vanishingly rare. This, as far as I know, is the only surviving one. They highlight the relationship between the Postmaster General and his employees, and how postmasters were monitored, held accountable, and disciplined. Whitley viewed these articles as a means to keep employees honest, and the obligations they outlined were explicitly cited when questioning the performance of individual postmasters, something that Whitley did almost daily, passive-aggressively, sometimes just aggressively. Whitley's mantra was, as he wrote to these postmasters, consider your articles. Crucially, print ensured that such terms of employment could be and were seen to be standardized. As Whitley explained, when individuals questioned elements of their contract, should I take up employment on these terms? He insisted they are things of form. There was no room for variation, and he explicitly said that their widespread acceptance was a reason against raising any scruples about the terms of employment. Secondly, print was used in relation to the vital issue, and one with depressing modern resonances, of financial accounting within the post office. And as with the recent post office scandal, great and perhaps undue faith was placed in technology. Whitley invoked these kinds of articles when highlighting postmasters' obligations to provide regular accounts regarding the volume and the letter and value of the letters that they were handling. And printed bills or forms, pro formas, became standard issue. Postmasters were expected to, quote, account on the printed bills routinely. Whitley referred to daily printed bills. These were evidently separate from quarterly accounts that were sent up to London on printed tickets to be collected into yet another printed bill and entered into the clerk's books, which were, you guessed it, printed for expedition and exactness in their terms. Expedition and exactness. None, as far as I can tell, none of this material survives. But what we can find are other printed documents designed to ensure efficiency and to enforce discipline. These are printed labels, dispatch labels, forms, be filled in by postmasters en route. Attached to every mail bag, they require postmasters to log the times of arrival and dispatch, thereby demonstrating attentiveness to their articles, which specified how quickly mail was to be turned around at each stage. Both turnaround times, as speedy as 15 minutes, and the use of the idea that labels would be used had been mandated for decades. But it seems doubtful that these requirements were or could be observed before the adoption of print and mass production. Crucially, surviving bundles of these labels demonstrate how print facilitated the implementation of a more robust process, making it possible to identify how far speeds were being made, where problems lay. They also attest to the attentiveness of officials in London, who analysed such material, it seems, within hours. Clerks reported on them to the Deputy Postmaster, who in turn reported to the Postmaster General and even the Secretaries of State. Whitley fed the information downwards, honouring his promise to quicken postmasters by the labels. He deployed concrete evidence with alacrity, peppering his letters to local officials with references to what appears by the label, or what I find by this day's label, invariably poor performance. He demonstrated where slackness occurred. You were 7 hours riding 2 miles. He chided poor performers. He reminded employees about the need to keep time and date your labels justly. He emphasised to postmasters that labels were sent constantly to Whitehall and that the Secretaries of State, no less, constantly examined the labels. He threatened that slackers might be arrested and called to account, insisting that you have eyes upon you, and that a severe eye was kept upon the entire system, including on him. Printed labels were what made such claims plausible, and their evidence was ultimately used to dismiss wayward postmasters and indeed postmistresses. Thirdly, from 1637 onwards, postmasters were routinely issued with printed instructions. These two are rare. I apologise for the quality of this image, but it's because it's really rare. Again, a routine document that we hardly have any surviving examples of. Printed instructions, setting out their responsibilities, riding speeds, the treatment of passengers, the use of post bags, post horns, but also their privileged status. Postmasters were exempt from service on juries, attendance at inquests, and quarter sessions. As with the printed proclamations from the King regarding postmasters' immunity from military service or military impressment, again, dispatched to every employee, these apparently straightforward texts were much more significant because they were produced, they are large, they were produced for display in every post office around the country. Whitley referred to printed papers to put up at the several letter offices, noted that it would be convenient to hang such texts in a frame at your door or to set up postboard. Such comments indicate that administrative texts also served as certificates of status, show it to your JP, your deputy lieutenant who wants to enlist you in the army, but as also as advertising. And these texts were deployed alongside other printed tickets, so-called, which Whitley advocated using to promote the postal service in specific places, not least as a reliable alternative to stationery. These could be displayed, he said, at your door, in the marketplace, on castle gates, and other places about town. They were in part intended to help people, quote, find the office, but also to dispose the country to write by the post. And they contributed to localised paper wars between rival ventures. These texts projected, and some more than others perhaps, projected governmental authority and did more than merely spread the message about the need to maintain an official monopoly. They also, it seems to me, constructed the figure of the provincial postmaster or postmistress. They set expectations, and they promoted the idea of accountability. So ephemeral, including the most mundane printed documents, the four, made the post office a public service like no other in the 17th century. projecting the vision of an infrastructure that was extensive and efficient, reliable, well-regulated. Whether it performed well or proved deficient, it was highly visible and its fortunes were hard to ignore. So my fourth and final point is that ephemeral highlights how the relationship between the postal system and a broader, ephemeral highlights the relationship between the postal system and a broader infrastructure of print and information, and how this was conceptualized and practiced, and what this meant in terms of political power and political culture. In essence, the post office was central to the well-known relationship between print and news culture in the 17th century. So it's integral to that on the one hand, and to institutions like coffee houses on the other. So historians are familiar with the rise of print and the rise of coffee houses. They've neglected to insert the post office as a kind of crucial part of that framework. It's also relevant, the post office is also relevant as such, perhaps, to profound concerns about censorship, sedition, and official propaganda. So as I've hinted already, coffee houses were central to the world of projectors, bases from which to operate, venues where texts could be circulated and discussed. But also alongside booksellers, coffee houses featured prominently as the kind of post offices, the receiving houses for the penny post. The majority of receiving houses in London are either booksellers or coffee houses. More important still was the relationship between the post office and official newspapers. The London Gazette was frequently used to promote and defend the service, to alert the public about changes to personnel and routes, postal routes, to enhance provision and frequency, to the rectifying of abuses. Following the paper trail for such adverts, the paper trail does exist, often leads back directly to officials in the post office headquarters in Lombard Street, but also, interestingly, to provincial postmasters, like a man called Robert Taylor, who instigated such adverts from Chichester to announce new services that he was setting up in Chichester. The Gazette was also distributed systematically to local postmasters as a contractual matter, not as a perk, but as a substitute for salary, or portion of salary. Deploying such material was central to official management of the postal infrastructure, and the logic was entirely clear, and indeed overt. Postmasters accepted copies of the Gazette, not simply because they were news-hungry citizens, but also because, in a system where most of them ran coaching inns, almost invariably coaching inns, they sought to attract customers and generate income. And that's sold to them in that way. This will draw income to your inn. What worked for them worked for the government, which clearly anticipated that copies of the Gazette would be made publicly available, thereby maximising the impact and geographical reach of official news. Indeed, given the aspiration at this time to maintain a government news monopoly, postmasters were crucial to undermining establishments, including coffee houses, which provided or might provide alternative sources of news. Also noteworthy is how one postal clerk, it will appear on screen presently, a man called Robert Clavel, developed an officially approved sideline, there you go, in printed catalogues of new books, distributed to hundreds of postmasters as a marketing tool, and inevitably promoted with a printed flyer. Equally clear is the involvement of postmasters, however, in the production of news, and not merely distributing. This synergy, a really profound synergy, it seems to me, between the postal system and the news revolution of the 17th century, was well established. One of the least well-known things about Henry Robinson in the 1630s is he's supplying regular newsletters to patrons and clients. One aspect of what he does. the other end of the 17th century, the preeminent purveyor of scribal news, subscription, handwritten newsletter service in the late 17th century, an incredibly important man called John Dyer. He began his public career in a hosiery shop in London, which doubled as a post office. In 1661, the Edinburgh postmaster, Robert Mean, was authorised to print and publish a weekly newspaper to prevent, it was said, false news, which may be invented by evil and disaffected persons. So we can find these examples that demonstrate this synergy between postal service and need. But these cases, I guess, are exceptional. What was utterly commonplace was for provincial postmasters to provide intelligence into Whitehall in return for copies of the Gazette, and to become reliable government informers, whose letters could then be inserted, more or less unedited, into the Gazette. So this integration of the post office into a wider infrastructure of print inevitably proved controversial. And the desire to monopolise news and topical debate was as contentious as the attempt to monopolise letter carrying. As a perk, postal clerks in London in the head office could contract to supply provincial readers with printed news and indeed other printed material, post-free. But this raised questions, they get an income from it. But this raised questions about whether too much material was being distributed, hitting revenue, and whether the wrong kind of material was being circulated. Richard Forster received multiple copies of the Gazette in return for his intelligence from Newcastle, and explicitly requested more. I want more newspapers. I want copies of the Dutch newspapers. And officials at this stage get trouble. Is there too much print that can get fed out through this postal network? In a context where customers grumbled about being charged for items that were enclosed with letters, merchants' accounts, and so on, protests were also made about attempts to restrain the circulation of this kind of printed news in parliamentary votes. So eventually officials start saying, we need to stop this happening. But as soon as they do that, people protest, as if getting hold of this information is a natural right. Things, in other words, votes and newsbook, vital for the information of the kingdom, as one protest, a printed protest, put it. This printed protest, a printed campaign to defend the circulation of this material, done via print, because they said it's much cheaper to do that than to try and fight the government through the law. So in other words, the desire to control the flow of correspondence was inextricably linked to issues of censorship and press control. The Privy Council expressed concern that stagecoaches were conveying pamphlets as well as letters. Proclamations regarding the postal monopoly insisted that the secret and indirect conveyance of letters provided a means to promote seditious designs. The threat came not just from interlopers, stagecoach operators, but also from wayward or indeed disaffected postmasters, some of whom clearly exploited their position and their ins for political agitation through print. One campaigner against stagecoaches, a man called John Cresson, blatantly sought to appropriate the postal system, encouraging postmasters en masse to capitalise upon their prominence within local communities by helping him to organise a national petitioning campaign. What better way of organising a national petitioning campaign than to kind of appropriate or hijack the postal system? So in short, ephemeral print demonstrates how official determination to control the postal system extended beyond a monopoly on letter carrying, they definitely wanted that, to censorship and propaganda, intelligence and surveillance, as postmasters and postmistresses were co-opted into a range of communicative processes and practices, governmental processes, while also having the capacity to move beyond being mere tools of a centralised bureaucracy. So, to bring things to a conclusion, so I began with one emblematic text, and I close with another. An advertisement from Their Majesties General Post Office, produced by John Wilden, Postmaster General in 1690. This highlights again how postal services were promoted and contested, and concerns raised by a state monopoly. Wildman's goal was to quash rumours dispersed in coffee houses and other public places of meeting that mail was routinely being stopped, broken open by officials, not least to manipulate parliamentary elections. He appreciated that the post office was perceived to have become a political weapon of state, thereby undermining its reputation and a vital revenue stream. So we had to insist, no, nothing to see here. We are not intercepting your mail. I fear nobody believed it. Wildman's advert also confirms that the post office was swathed in print, and the aim of this talk has been to use print ephemera to illuminate the contemporary significance of the postal infrastructure, to highlight the value of an infrastructural approach. This certainly means grappling with technical issues, the scale and speed of the post service, but it also means examining how contemporaries understood the place of postal services within their economy, their society, their political culture, and the relationships involved. Print is not our only tool in this regard, but it certainly offers a vital window into the world of the post. It opens up avenues for inquiry, it facilitates connections across different dimensions of contemporary life, and it provides opportunities for seeing things that might not otherwise be clearly visible, and perhaps some things that are not visible at all otherwise. This ephemera helps to reveal ideas about the purpose of a postal system, about how and by whom it should be run, territory that was contested given delicate issues around revenue and security, centralisation, state formation. Debates over the postal system reveal politically loaded ideas about improvement, economic progress, the public good, about administrative processes and governmental practices, and about power and political liberties, all of which involved reflections upon the circulation, people, objects, ideas, and upon the reflections upon the kind of infrastructure that could foster and perhaps control communication, interaction, and exchange. Some of that control was great, for some it was terrifying. People from all walks of life, importantly, and all parts of the country were confronted by the postal system as an entity and a conveyor of ideas, as its services became a visible presence, even in far-flung places. Even humble people were encouraged to think about the post in terms of service standards that they themselves could measure against promises, public promises, and expectations, in comparison with rival services and operators. And they could appreciate an infrastructure that was extensive, efficient, and affordable, and also robust, secure, and well-managed, or assess whether these things were true. This credibility, as well as the need to ensure reliable revenue streams, explains the official obsession with expedition and security. It was hard not to notice that the postal system was contested between different interest groups and different visions of society. Hard for them to avoid reflecting upon the connection between everyday business, national issues, and lofty concepts. The postal system became central to how people encountered issues and processes regarding the power of the state and the liberties of the subject, as officials sought to influence and monitor local postmasters, to ensure oversight, accountability, and discipline, and to impose standardized working conditions, all of which impinged upon highly visible characters within local communities. Every dimension of the postal system, its promotion, its operating processes, and importance for political communication, was reliant upon print. And even the most ephemeral texts, tickets, labels, forms, reveal its workings and were loaded with meaning regarding the purpose and status of the service and the power relationships involved. These relationships certainly involve the humble postmaster and postmistress, linchpins of a national infrastructure whose roles and responsibilities were complex. Like other local officials, such people became directly connected to the centre. They acquired opportunities for engaging with and participating in government processes far beyond their official formal duties, and they had opportunities to resist as well as to follow orders from a centralised bureaucracy. But the postal system also affected the relationship between ordinary people and their government. It provided a quotidian means of encountering and experiencing national government, national politics, and national news, and of participating by making choices, choices as letter writers, choices as readers, and by contributing, as was expected, to the process of keeping postmasters and postmistresses honest, by discreet criticism, but also public condemnation. Such participation was often undramatic, but it was pervasive. In order to understand the early modern period and the changes that it witnessed, it's vital to bring that kind of infrastructure into focus. And in order to do that, it's imperative to scrutinise the printed texts with which they were suffused and surrounded. Thank you.